to meet the challenges of this a demanding role. And once a scout left Confederate lines, he was not expected to return unless he was carrying a message or bringing in prisoners. Each scout carried 2 or more revolvers, and if he had a shoulder weapon, it was almost always in the form of a double-barrel shotgun. He was responsible for providing his own nourishment and getting forage for his horse. He expected to sleep in the forest. He expected to sleep in the swamps. He expected to sleep in abandoned buildings. And hopefully, during the cold winter months up in Virginia, he might get a night or 2 at the home of a friendly Virginia family. But he would never sleep in the same place 2 nights in a row. Now the missions, what did John Willingham and the Iron Scouts do? First, foremost and always was a gathering of military intelligence. These 20 scouts didn't ride together all in one body. They split into multiple teams depending on with the size depending on the particular mission, the territory to be covered, and the threat that they may expect. The scout teams could be as many as 6, could be as many as 2. They never scouted in less than a pair. Now, John Willingham may have scouted this week with 2 buddies, but next week he may be with 5 others. So it all depended on what the situation called for. The scouts often had to ride close to their target area, dismount, leave their horses in the woods, and then proceed on foot 2 or 3 miles before they could actually lay eyes on what they wanted to observe. They watched the railroad, they watched the base camps, the supply depots. They monitored troop movements. They looked at camp activities. They looked for signs of impending threats, such as sudden troop movements of Union units, or concentrations. All of a sudden, they're concentrating in a particular area. Were the troops in camp? Were they loading? Were they cooking extra rations and distributing ammunition? Were they forming and loading wagon trains? They looked for any sign of Union threats. Now, this was dangerous work, but their timely, accurate, and highly detailed reports gave their generals an in-depth view, wide and deep, of what was going on within the Union Army. This was dangerous work, and one source wrote, quote, "On an average day, a good scout rode with information in one hand and his life in the other," end quote. This was everyday work for John Willingham during his time as a scout. Wade Hampton's Iron Scouts became a crucial and absolutely vital part of General Jeb Stuart's widespread intelligence network, highly effective network, by the way. General Robert E. Lee once said of Stuart, quote, "General Stuart never brought me false information," end quote. Much of the information that Jeb Stuart took to Robert E. Lee came from Wade Hampton's Iron Scouts. John Willingham certainly had his role in gathering that information, which ultimately went to Lee. While scouting for military intelligence, the scouts were passive. They didn't want to be seen. They didn't want to be detected. But the environment they were in was dangerous, but they also saw it as target rich. And when they saw the opportunity to strike the enemy a blow, they did. They were masters of guerrilla warfare. The scouts had an immediate and powerful impact on within the Union lines because of their activities, and they created nightmares for the enemy with their guerrilla activities. Small Union patrols, 6 to 12 men, would be attacked by 2 or 3 scouts. It'd be destroyed. Reserve picket posts were captured. couriers just gobbled up. Scouts got them. In the span of just a couple of months after being formed, their guerrilla activities led to a decree by Union generals that any cavalry patrol leaving the base camp within their own lines should be in a strength of at least 50 men. That'll tell you, I mean, these scouts were cleaning house. John Willingham was involved in these guerrilla activities. Now, most of the guerrilla activities involved the teams of 2 to 5 men, but when the circumstances allowed for it, the sergeant commanding the scouts would call in all his teams and form a strike force. When he saw the opportunity to hit a vulnerable Union a command or position, he would do this. In February of 1863 alone, he had 3 major strike force events. Number 1, he called in, he got 11 scouts, and they ambushed and destroyed a 64-man company of Union cavalry. Shortly afterward, 17 scouts were gathered together, and they ambushed and destroyed a 45-man company of Union cavalry. But the crowning moment, though, was when 15 scouts were gathered together as a strike force, and they hit and utterly routed a Union regiment of cavalry. John Willingham was there. He had his 2 revolvers or more, and if the targets of opportunity were too large for the scouts to handle, even as a strike force, they were unlike today's special forces or those of Vietnam, who could call in artillery or air support or maybe naval gunfire. What the scouts did in the 1860 was send a rider on a fast horse to General Hampton or one of his subordinate officers, advising that we've got a vulnerable Union command or position, and if you can give us, it's too large for us, but if you can give us 40 or 50 armed men, well-armed men, we can take them down. And invariably, their requests were granted. This shows the full trust and faith given to scouts by their senior commanders. It also emphasizes the aggressive nature of the scouts. Another mission that you don't ever hear about. The scouts were called on to carry secret messages between the Confederate High Command and its agents, their spies, as far north as Alexandria, Virginia, just outside Washington, D.C. That shows the total faith and trust from the highest levels on their dependability. One other thing, the scouts and John Willingham, on one occasion, reinforced the Gray Ghost, John Mosby, in one of his larger raids in May of 1863. John Willingham was involved in all these missions and activities that I've covered. As an original member of the Iron Scouts, he served in this role for 14 consecutive months with just one major interruption. In June of 1863, the Scouts were disbanded, and the men were returned to their regiments to ride in the Gettysburg campaign. When the Army returned to Virginia, the Scouts were quickly reestablished, and John Willingham was back in the field scouting. At one point, from mid-August 1863 to mid-October, 8 consecutive weeks, he spent 8 consecutive weeks behind the enemy lines, within the enemy lines, scouting, carrying out guerrilla activities, serving in strike forces. Imagine 56 consecutive days and nights deep within Union lines. You may only be with one or two friendly men, where capture and death could be upon you at any moment. He must have had nerves of steel. To answer a couple of questions you may have in your mind at this point, the scouts received no promotions, no extra pay, no extra privilege. They received absolutely no tangible reward of any sort for their dangerous work. You may ask, what kind of uniform was John Willingham and his compatriots wearing behind Union lines? They wore Confederate gray. They did not ride around in Union uniforms. They were regularly enlisted soldiers, and they fought as regularly enlisted soldiers. Another name, or another question you may have, is where did the name Iron Scouts come from? Boy, that's got a ring to it, doesn't it? Officially, the Scouts were known as Hampton Scouts, but they received the name Iron Scouts by the Yankees, who seemed to think that after multiple encounters with the Scouts seemed to be bulletproof. To the Yankees' eyes, it didn't matter how many times they shot at them, they couldn't seem to hit them. We find many examples in the records attesting to the reasoning that the Yankees had to give them this name. Hampton's Iron Scouts came from the Yankees. In fact, just 4 scouts were killed in scouting duties during the 28 months of service. Now, John Willingham's time as an Iron Scout ended in early 1864 when his regiment was returned to the Palmetto State. He was back in the saddle again, patrolling and picketing along the coast. And then he became deeply involved in the Carolinas campaign facing Sherman's hordes. When General Joseph Johnston surrendered the army to Sherman in April of 1865, John returned home without taking parole. Just most all the cavalry, when they heard that the army was being surrendered, they mounted their horses and they went home. John did that. Further, he never took the oath of allegiance. John Willingham married. He became a farmer and a businessman. He raised a family. He died way too early, age 51. He never wrote of his wartime experiences. Oh, what tales he could have told. But we're fortunate in that we know enough about his service, that we understand that what we do know is precious, and we need to use that precious legacy as inspiration as we go on. Thank you all very much.
Let's give Mr. Thomas another round of applause for that presentation. On March 18 of this year, the men of the Rivers Bridge Camp met here that morning with the goal of cleaning up the cemetery and the church grounds and installing 9 Southern Crosses of Honor that you're going to see here today. Not long after that, we committed to planning and hosting a ceremony to dedicate these 9 crosses. As we gather here today at this historic site, we remember the sacrifice that these 9 men made when their state called upon them. These brave men took up arms to defend their homes, their wives, their families, and their right to self-determination in a gallant struggle against tyranny. a struggle that left 1/4 of the men of fighting age of South Carolina dead in 4 years. Miss Tucker sang the song "Lest We Forget" so beautifully as we opened our ceremony this morning. It is up to us to keep the memory of these brave men alive. We've heard that challenge repeated here today. Perhaps no better than Mr. Blackwell. We must not only dedicate these crosses in their honor, but we must dedicate ourselves to preserving their memory for future generations. President Jefferson Davis said the following, quote, "Nothing fills me with deeper sadness than to see a Southern man apologizing for the defense we made of our inheritance. Our cause was so just, so sacred, that had I known all that had come to pass, had I known what was to be inflicted upon me, all that my country was to suffer, all that our posterity was to endure, I would do it all over again." We now face great opposition in our struggle to preserve Southern history and Southern heritage and our Southern way of life. But we must not stop working. Great opposition did not deter these men that are buried here, nor should it deter us. In fact, we must now work harder than ever before, harder to tell the true stories of these men and their fight for Southern freedom. General Robert E. Lee called us to tell the true history of the South. He said the following, "Everyone should do all in his power to collect and disseminate the truth in hope that it may find a place in history and descend to posterity. History is not the relation of campaigns and battles and generals or other individuals, but that which shows the principles for which the South contended and which justified her struggle for those principles." Today, the 9th day of December, the year of our Lord Jesus Christ, 2023, we dedicate these 9 Southern Crosses of honor to these men who so courageously fought in the greatest army to ever take the field of battle. As I read the names of the Confederate soldiers interred here at historic Smyrna Baptist Church, I'd ask you to stand in their honor. Our ladies can stay, our widows to stay seated. I want everybody else to stand, please. Captain Dr. Benjamin Lawton, a signer of the South Carolina Secession Ordinance. Private John C. Willingham, one of Hampton's Iron Scouts. Lieutenant Colonel B.B. Kirkland, who was wounded at 2nd Manassas. Private M.H. Roberts. Private Henry Hearn, who was a POW. Private James R. Yeomans. Private Reverend Charles B. Reeves, who was a POW at Harts Island, New York. Private Joseph Orstreicher, and Private Charles Jacob Gray. These are the 9 men that we're here to remember today. I'm going to ask the men of the Rivers Bridge Camp that are going to escort our widows to the graves now, if they would form up over here on my left.
People can lay behind sitting on the grave.
All right, we got 8 there, correct? If I can count correctly this morning, I'll make number 9 then. What we're going to do now is we're going to ask our ladies, starting with Miss Sharp. They're going to come to the table and grab a rose off the table, pick up a rose, and then one of our members of our camp are going to escort them to a grave, and we're going to lay the rose on the grave